Great, we should be live now.
What would we be live on? No, it's just that on
Should be live on YouTube.
Oh, okay, yeah, we can get that. Thank you.
Great. So welcome to round one of 2023 Nationals, everyone. What I'll first do is I'll get the adjudication panel to all introduce themselves, their names and pronouns.
Kia ora, my name's Megan, I prefer she, they pronouns.
Cool. Hi, I'm Zach. G'day.
Hi, Harry Hino.
Perfect. And I'll just get the first team, which is the affirmative team, Wellington Gold, to introduce their names and pronouns.
Kia ora, Teresa, she, her, first and leaders.
I'm James, I use any pronouns and I'll be doing second.
I'm Zandi and my pronouns are he, him and I'll be doing third.
Perfect. And then the negating team, Kahurangi-Marlborough, I'll just get each of you to do your names and pronouns. Thank you.
I'm Riley, he, him. I'm Finn, he, him.
I'm Stella, she, they.
Perfect. So if everyone's ready to go, we'll get the first speaker of the affirmative team to come up.
So some of the motions.
I can read out the motion. One moment.
Yeah, this house.
Yeah. Alright, and the motion is that political parties should be state funded instead of receiving private donations.
Private donations give an incentive for parties to pander their policies towards the rich, meaning more policy benefits the already privileged in society, increasing the inequality that we see today. Our solution on side F is that we propose the state funds all parties an equal amount of money based on the rules that already exist in a country towards what is not like a political party. We think that more campaign funding means more door knockers and more ads, which means more votes, which directly influences like who gets into parliament, who gets into government. But we don't base this debate just in New Zealand. So the outcome of this is that poor and rich people are the outcome of this policy is poor and rich people end up as valuable as each other to parties when they're policy making, when they're advertising, and ultimately when they're in government making decisions. We think that under side neg, when private donations are the only incentive a party has to make their decisions, rich people end up more valuable to them than poor people, which we see as just principally bad, but also I'm just going to get onto some mechanisms for how that works. So firstly, why are parties forced to pander practically to the rich when they're making decisions? And then principally, why is that bad? Secondly, what is the impact of lobbyists on either system? And how is that like a benefit to us, like the decrease of lobbyists? So,
On that.
why parties are forced to pander? No, thank you. Parties are under pressure, right? Like a lot of money goes into a political campaign, and parties under a private system therefore must have the rich on their side when they're making decisions and creating policy, because otherwise they lose all their funding for a campaign and don't get into government to do the things they want to do. Regardless of how well-intentioned a party is, they want to get into government, they want to get into parliament to solve, the poverty crisis, right? But to do that, they must accept $2 million from, big oil, limited to set aside climate change for the next 3 years, right? We just don't see that as a benefit because we want parties to be making decisions that will benefit the most people rather than the people that will fund that party the most. So Therefore, policy that is popular among the majority of people is deprioritized, is slashed, is ignored, because if a party makes that tax increase or introduces something that is like anti-mega rich, they lose their funding for the next election, and therefore they can't do the things that they want to do. So parties and governments take fewer risks, like make fewer hard decisions against the massively privileged, because their next campaign is riding on the support of those people, and therefore they do not value the poor or the people who aren't donating to them as highly as they value the people who are donating to them. So, like, what do we see under the current system, right? So underprivileged people are struggling to buy their groceries, are like living like it with black mold in their houses, while some CEO sits in a fifth Bugatti. And this wealth divide, the money that sits in the hands of rich people, could be taxed in new policy to improve the lives of those underneath. Like this looks like adding a percent to the top tax bracket so we can remove GST on groceries, right? Like stuff like that parties can't make those decisions, because if they do, then they're going to lose the support of the people who are funding their campaigns, and they can't do that. Like, what that money holds, like under a donation funded party system, is unjust power that we don't support. When a party's future lies in the dollars of individuals, each decision that party makes has to be carefully crafted as to not scare away the rich. So under our system, parties make the changes or propose the changes that will benefit the most people, including the poor and including the non-donators, right? They want all votes, not just rich votes. The incentive should be on a party to benefit the most people in society, get the votes of the most people, and we would like a government that benefits all. Principally, on top of those mechanisms, we think that the value of a vote, which influences the experience of a population, so therefore the value of that vote is the value of a person, should not be a sliding scale to who can give a party the most monetary help in the next election. We think that it's principally wrong. Someone's wealth shouldn't indicate the importance of their beliefs. So under the first point, we saw that the average policy is worse for the poor. But under side neg, one extremely harmful policy, like on a more extreme note, can be implemented when one lobby group sends a single email with one multimillionaire in their midst, right? Before I go on to this second point, I'll take a POA.
Doesn't equal funding give disproportionate weight to niche extremist parties like the New Conservatives?
We actually think that that parties, A, are popular for a reason, but B, are popular because they have a lot of ads, right? When we take away the ads thing, we take away the harm of like parties' incentives to make money. But we think that like maybe if we give a few $1,000s to the New Conservatives, yes, they'll be able to put up a few more ads. But with a party like the New Conservatives, if we're talking about New Zealand here, right, a lot of their popularity is still based on like who agrees with their views. We're not taking like it doesn't have as much. Yeah, I don't think that's relevant, because I think there are many factors in people's votes, and this is just removing one of the bad incentives for parties, which affects like the poor disproportionately. So secondly, what is the impact of lobbyists creating extremely harmful policies on the people of a country? So when you give money all of the power in an election and in a campaign, groups like the NRA, like as an example, will recognize this, and they only have to have 100 millionaire in their support to make a party pander to their beliefs, pander to what they want, instead of a party being able to make their own decisions based on what the majority of people want. So this looks like the NRA funding Republican candidates to block any attempts at removing guns from the hands of school shooters. Like, more funding equals more votes, and then once the Republican Party gets in, gun laws cannot be tightened, right? Lives cannot be saved, because all of their a part of their success rides on the support of the NRA and rides on the support of the rich, which we don't support.
On that.
So, yes.
Don't companies just use less direct methods of getting this money to the political parties?
We think that there are laws in place to stop like illegal bribery, and we think that a vast majority of lobbying, like under the status quo or under your side of the house, is like implicit. It's not so explicit as like handing someone $10,000 under the table if they like will let oil drilling go on under the table, right? It looks more like the stuff like the NRA being like, hey, like here's $2 million. If you don't do what we want next election, that we take that away, right? We think it's more implicit than that. So this can also look like social policy. It takes one man named John with a lot of money who like is really anti-gay, right? to tell a party, you can have $10,000 if you don't ban conversion therapy in the next 3 years, right? You can have $10,000 if you tighten abortion laws, right? The problem with a private donation system is that so much power lies in the hands of those who have money, and we see that having money isn't always an indication of hard work. Oftentimes it's just an indication of generational wealth, which is kind of what we're attacking here, right? We think that the problem with giving power to those with money is that when someone with money has a belief that's opposite to someone with not much money, a party is always going to choose the one who has money, even if the other policy is more popular within the general scheme of things. If there's more people in support versus a rich person in support, how do we see that weight on either side of the house? We see that it's a harm if a party puts all the power in the hands of the rich as opposed to in the hands of the people. Thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to thank the speaker for an amazing speech, and I now welcome up the first speaker of the Negami team to open their case.
When the opposing side comes out and does not even explain how the state will give them money, we can prove why, in our path to victory, that their model will actually worsen corruption whilst harming the everyday person. We stand for the status quo. What does the opposition stand for? They have stated that the state will give them funding. They have not stated what parties will receive how much. They have not stated who will give the funding in the first place. This means that under the assumption based on their answer to the POI, they will be giving everyone equal funding under the system. First, I will step through the issues with that, and then I will go into some rebuttal, as well as then work into my first point about how it worsens corruption, and then my second point about how it's worse for the people on the ground. What is the issue with everyone receiving equal funding? Well, first of all, it harms the biggest, most desperate parties. These parties are desperate because they've gone from earning so much to so little, assuming that they are equal funding. Because bigger parties will always have more funding under the status quo, obviously, right? And when they go to the system, we can't just give the same amount of funding that they had prior to every single party unless we want to disproportionately harm everyone involved. This means that these smaller parties will now have an outsized influence and be able to buy more advertising that will reach people when on the status quo, they tend to get not as much funding. Anti-vax parties do not tend to get that funding that allows them to run advertisements in the first place. Now, first, let me start on some rebuttal. They have stated that the government has no incentive to listen to poor people at all. First of all, they have an incentive because they obviously want to get re-elected, as they have stated prior. The majority of people are not wealthy billionaires, and these are the people that the government must appeal to in order to get re-elected in the first place. Second of all, parties will still get funding from other sources other than just rich people. It is an unfair assumption to say that parties solely receive money from rich people, when the average day person obviously does donate as well, as we have seen from donation campaigns run by parties across the world, e.g. the Republicans, e.g. Labour here.
On that,
they also stated that parties need funding to make ads, obviously, and that how under their system, these parties, such as New Conservative, will get more ads and how it won't actually have an impact. But we have stated that it gives them a bigger voice, like they directly get to reach more people with more advertising if they have more money to spend on advertising. They also stated that parties will choose policies that give them the most money. This is simply not true, as they want to earn as many votes as possible. They want to win elections and stay in power. They do not want to simply earn money and then fall out of an election in the first place, because the people will still have a say. Now on to my first point on why it worsens corruption. For some context, the incentives of the status quo obviously don't go away for companies. They still want to pass this harmful legislation that they have stated is happening under the status quo. They still want to push their agenda. Companies want to get this because they obviously want to promote the best political and legislative outcomes for them to make more money. What this means is that they will resort to more under-the-table deals, obviously. For example, they will pay for other parties' expenses. They may host formal dinners, they may host more parties, and they may deflate the prices of their assets and then sell them to the party in the first place. This means that companies will make deals with people in charge of parties in order to push their agenda illegally. This is because of the profit incentive, as I've stated before. They want to avoid that harmful legislation, and the only way to influence politics for them in the first place will now be illegal, which means that the one way that they have that influence that will affect them the most, legislation, is now illegal. They will obviously want to pursue that to make as much money as possible, as we have seen already from cigar companies and what have you. They will also offer token jobs more often. This means that companies offer jobs to politicians with massive wages, which act as indirect bribes to support them politically and get their support as a politician. Without private donations, more companies will do it in order to pursue their desired change for the aforementioned profit incentive to prevent harmful legislation that restricts, say, cigarettes for cigarette companies. They obviously don't want harmful legislation passed outlawing them. They want to pursue this to keep making money in the first place. It also means that without that legal alternative, it's harder to identify fraud in the first place. There's no official channel to track who is donating what. So when these companies make these large donations, obviously they have an incentive to do it legally. They don't want to pay massive disproportionate fines. So now when they do it illegally, we have no way to even track if there's something shady going on under the table. We have no legal mechanism for which the state can track where the money is going, where it's coming from. It will take more investigation overall. The outcome of this is corporations will actually have more influence compared to the status quo. They will have more ability to push this harmful legislation that they have stated is occurring, because they will have more politicians being paid for by them with favors owed to them and whatnot, as I've stated before. And it also means that people will have less faith in the government in the first place. They will see them pushing legislation that helps corporations more than them, which means that they will obviously turn to these radical parties which are receiving more advertising in the first place, as I stated before, that want more extreme action to be taken. This will obviously mean that more people are being pushed into extremism, which has negative impacts on us all, as they promote negative outcomes for fringe and minority groups which are already being oppressed under these parties' visions. Now on to my second point, but before that I'll take a POI.
Do you think it's easier to influence a party via like a massive donation, or via a dinner party where you just kind of like slip them a fiver under the table?
I think it's harder to influence parties because parties now have a direct legal way to see, people now have a direct legal way to see who has been donated what, obviously. This means that they can see who is getting paid what by what company to push something. When it's done illegally, they do not have that transparency in the first place. Now on to my second point about how it harms people on the ground. So in the current, for some context, there's a massive recession going on in most nations around the world because of COVID-19, obviously, and the after effects of that. We see nations are struggling economically, but especially the people. We see this as inflation, job shortages, and therefore an increased cost of living that many people are struggling under. Now, the public will care about themselves, obviously. We've seen in New Zealand that people are striking, such as teachers. In Britain, people are striking, such as nurses, to get more benefits. So now when the state must fund parties in the first place, where does this money come from? Where is the state getting this money to fund these parties in the first place? We have seen that people obviously are taking action for this money, so when it's taken away, what does that result in? We have also proven that this policy hasn't changed anything, so proving that this point has the most harms will obviously make us win the debate if their points do not even change anything in the first place. It also means, on the ability of harming people on the ground, that people will be asked for donations more. We have seen that parties already rely on public donations, and that they will simply ask for them more if they are relying on this as a legal alternative to getting, say, massive private donations. We have seen parties running donation campaigns in the first place, targeting people such as the elderly, the vulnerable people who are more likely to give massive amounts to these parties in the first place, with often manipulative language that targets them as a person and requests their direct support. These are people that are already struggling due to inflation harming their pensions, for example. So the outcome of this is that there will be less money invested in other services, obviously, because there will have to be somewhere this money is coming from, or you are just printing more, which is blatantly bad because it creates inflation in the first place. So you will have to cut some sort of fringe services, e.g. mental health support, which is often very fringe in many countries and does not receive adequate funding. And these stretched budget organizations will have less ability to help those in need. So this looks like people getting worse mental health outcomes. They have no ability to connect with these organizations in the first place because they are receiving less funding. They are already overstretched, and taking money away from those will only harm them. It also looks like worse outcomes for people that are losing access to any other services that have been defunded. If you take money away from healthcare, obviously you'll get a worse outcome for people in healthcare, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the second speaker of the affirmative team.
Sorry. Look, when the NRA are able to fund campaigns so they can ensure that policies that take the guns out of the hands of school shooters are unable to be passed, and the mega rich are able to bias politicians into being able to protect their fortunes that could help the most vulnerable people in our society, those are like harms that we cannot accept on our in this debate, and that is why we win 2 questions for you today. What are the effects on poorest people in our society, those most vulnerable? Secondly, what are the effects on extreme policy in that? So firstly, what is the effect on the poorest people in society, right? We heard 2 major lines from the negating team here. Firstly, that there will be less money for the government to spend on these policies, right? A couple of things against this here. Firstly, we think that actually government being able to make the best policy to help these people is the most important thing here, right? So when we told you at first that we reduce the incentives to pander to the rich and instead allow people to be able to go to poorer people because the only incentive is to get the most votes. No, thank you. Those policies will be more targeted to those people until we're going to get better policy outcomes, right? The alternative is not all of this money that we're spending here is going to be spent to help those people. It is actually going to be spent on tax breaks for the people that are actually having an effect on the system, right? We also just generally think that when we are more able to tax the rich, so we're going to get more money for these people to spend. Secondly, we also heard from them that actually instead of political organizations and the rich being able to lobby, they're going to illegally do this, right? We think even if we assume that every single mega rich person is willing to actively commit crime to be able to influence government, we think that we think that actually we will be able to catch this in some point. We're fraud prevention and that kind of thing is a thing, and we're going to use that to ensure that people aren't committing crime. We think that's very possible, right? We also don't actually understand what the harm of it being done this way as opposed to the other way, other than the fact that the benefit is that we actively discourage people from doing it because then they will be committing crime. People don't want to commit crime, and so they're not going to be because of the massive fines that the negating team actually talked about. So we actually think that these corporations are not going to be funding that way, which means we get less influence from these groups, which we think is very beneficial. No, thank you. We also heard from them that actually the middle class can, normal people can donate. Firstly, we think the effect of this is less than, mega billionaires being able to donate huge amounts of money, or the NRA being able to donate huge amounts of money. But we think that even for like, the normal people who are donating, that is only available to people that like have disposable income and not to like the poorest people in society, which we think is like particularly, harmful, right? We think this takes me into my split around like voter confidence, right? We think that when parties are receiving, this inordinate amounts of money from both the mega rich and just like generally richer people in society, right? Those people are having a like unfair impact on politics and policy, right? People know this, and so if you are unable to provide donations because you like do not have that kind of income, you will like know that you are worth less to the system and are unable to affect like policy change that you want, right? We think this is a harm in and of itself because the most vulnerable people in society now feel disaffected and disillusioned, right? Which we think is a harm. But also, these people, who now think that their vote is like meaningless because they'll never be able to compete with the people that can actually donate and can actually fund all these ads, they're going to be like less likely to vote because they see their vote as more insignificant, right? Which further disadvantages these groups that desperately need policy targeted towards them, right? We so like on our side of the house, we going to improve the ability for these people to get involved in politics because they recognize that they will be able to have the same impact as anybody else in today's debate, right? Okay, I'll take that before I move on.
What happens to the legion of campaign communications coordinators who lose their entire jobs when you cut the entire funding base of, say, the National Party?
Firstly, we think that this is kind of a very minor point compared to the ways that we are going to be be able to help these people. Secondly, we actually think that we will be able to provide government jobs in that way, in terms of just doing the things that we're talking about, being able to monitor this government funding anyway. Those things still exist to ensure that the illegal things aren't happening. But we also just think that is irrelevant compared to the other things we talked about. Okay, so moving on to what are the effects on extreme policy? We only have one major thing here from the affirming. From the negating team, and that was that they will get more funding for extremist parties, right? Firstly, we think that actually the policy outcome of this is very minimal, right? While we think major parties can use money quite effectively because they have policies that are likely to be able to be to convince people, right? We think that if you are on a extremely extremist platform, you aren't going to be able to convince the average person with an ad, and so the effect of the money on these groups is significantly less, and they're not going to get into a position where they'll be able to make a policy. So we don't actually think we don't actually see what the harm is there. Secondly, we think that generally these people actually are ones that have either specific mega rich donors who are donating to these parties because they're very ideologically tied to them, or have a very very riled up voter base who are also willing to give lots of money to these parties, right? So we actually think that these people are going to have less money in the hands of these people anyway, which we think is a massive benefit. Also, but even if it isn't, right, we think that these parties still will have a very low effect on government compared to that. So we are happy to accept that compared to other things. What have we told you on extreme policy? No, thank you. We told you that actually corporations lobby groups like the NRA are able to go and advocate for policies that are actively harmful for literally everybody in society other than them that are profiting off of it, and even well-meaning politicians who want to make positive change in other aspects are forced to take this money in order to compete with the other politicians that are, right? This means that they will be more likely to pass policy that is actively harmful because they want to stay in government to pass that, right? We think, and we think this interacts with the only thing we heard back against this is actually there'll be more illegal donations from these groups, right? But we actually provide a unique benefit to politicians who want to do good things, which we think are a lot of politicians, they no longer have to, take money from these groups in order to compete with people. They are allowed to, in order to compete with people, because because this is now illegal, and they are now allowed to stop that. And we don't think that even for politicians that are willing to take illegal donations, which we think is less because they don't want to lose their jobs or face criminal sentences because of that. But even for those, there will be less because there's a lesser incentive to invest from those groups in the first place because it is again a crime, right? So what have we told you, right? Fundamentally, we change the incentives for most parties in order to swing to more focus on the most vulnerable people in society. Secondly, we reduce the effect on extremist groups and donators who are making advocating for actively harmful policies democracy. And thirdly, we increase like voter confidence and like the ability for people like to believe that they vote and have the same has the same effect and like have a better views on our democracy at large. And for those reasons, so proud to affirm.
Great, so I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and now I welcome out the second speaker of the negating team.
Look, what we hear is NRA, NRA this, NRA that from the opposing side of the House. What we tell you is that the NRA is mostly comprised of like rich tycoons, rich people who form lobby groups. This isn't specific to the NRA, but also to many other lobby groups. These people are the ones that are likely to commit crime to get to this point where they are rich, likely to commit crime to the point where they are like have a genuine incentive on providing guns to a population that uses them completely inappropriately and exploits them. We tell you that these people are criminals, and therefore, yes, even under the status quo, they are circumventing laws around donations to political parties. What we haven't heard, what they haven't been able to tell us, is why these people aren't going to circumvent these rules under their side, simply because the Crown or the head of state gets up and says, oh, don't worry guys, you can stop, we'll take it from here. These people are literally one of the most likely groups to be criminals because they got to this position. In the case of the NRA, they are willing to market guns to a nation that is shooting children with them. They are not acting ethically. They are entirely likely to circumvent the rules that the AF team hasn't even given us, and therefore they are entirely likely to just completely continue donating to political parties. So what happens when these political parties continue to receive donations from the NRA? Well, I'll tell you, we still see all the harms that the opposing side has brought us, but what we also see under their world is the harms that I am about to tell you, the harms that Riley has told you, and the harms that Stella will tell you. Look, so firstly, on the New Conservatives, what we heard is that more ads doesn't equal more support. This is completely untrue, and this is not a thing for them to be saying at this point in their case for a few reasons. Firstly, they've got this internal case conflict because right at first, they came up and said, oh, right, so financially basically determines how many votes you get, because you get to send more people out on the doors, you get more ads. This is directly connected to how many votes that you get. Then they come up and say, oh, look, if New Conservatives just is going to get as many television ads as the Labour Party, which is like presumably quite a lot, again, we haven't heard, what this means is that they are going to spread. And what this means is that they are therefore going to get votes, presumably like equivalent under what they've said to what the Labour Party gets, which is a completely unfeasible and absurd case for them to be taking. Look, secondly, the New Conservatives, this is the second reason why they can't just say that it's untrue that more ads doesn't mean more support. The New Conservatives, as the example that we've given, and other groups that run on like a small platform of policy, but like most of this is very populist policy, very hateful policy, likely to be controversial, likely to be popular. The reason why these parties specifically spread is like, for example, take COVID and the New Conservatives, they spread through when everyone was on Facebook doing their own research, spreading misinformation. These parties go through fear. They are incredibly likely, therefore, to go through something like a well-done TV ad campaign, which presumably they would have as much money as both Labour and National to produce under their side. But no more on this. Look, laws stop illegal bribery is the next thing that we heard. Like, firstly, they don't. Secondly, we told you why they don't at Riley. At Riley, we told you that under your side, what you're going to see is these dodgy asset sales, these token wages to politicians, funding expenses of the political parties, and when they don't respond to this, all of this material that we brought you stands. When all of this material that we brought you stands, what it means is that we can just assume that all these rich people that work in these lobby groups, all these rich people who make individual donations to political parties, they are still likely to continue doing so, and we get all the harms that they have as well. Yeah, so what do you see under the F world? They spent huge portions of their speech saying why companies give money under the status quo. None of this changes under a world where the Crown steps in or like the head of state steps in and just says, yeah, don't do that, we'll take it. So to prove that these companies are going to do it, we need like two things, incentive and capability. Obviously there's incentive as to why these companies are likely to make donations. This exists under the status quo, this exists under their world, they've told us this. What we tell you is the capability, and we told you this right at third, through the things that I just listed. Dodgy asset sales, token wages, and funding expenses. No. So, what this means is that all of this still stands, and therefore we will go on to win the debate. The next thing we heard is this idea of like, OMG, what if rich people committed crime? Haha, lol. Unless. What we tell you is that they do commit crime. They already circumvent this law. They often become rich because they are likely to do this. As long as there are rich people, there are also their incentives, and therefore under both sides, we see this, the willingness of companies to do this, and on their side, you see it more. Look. Next, after this, I'm going to go into my split on the conflict of interest of the state. Look. Great. We tell you, the state is not some like magical, impartial entity that we can rely on to like step in and fund political parties. I'll tell you about the conflict of interests of the state. Look, so what happens when you get the state to step in? It means that people are like, yeah, sure, I'll take a point.
Why do you think no politicians will refuse illegal political donations when it means they could go to jail?
Look, politicians are already accepting illegal donations. Why do you think major political parties like receive donations just under the threshold for declaring your donation many times a second during like a week when they are particularly attacking for funding? What it means is that these people are already willing to circumvent the law. Politicians are gladly willing to accept this for the reasons that you yourself told us that they want to get into government so that they can enact the change, so that they can get paid and make what they think to be a change in the world even if they think they are a well-meaning party. So, look, conflict from the state. What it means, the state is not some like magical entity which can just be relied upon to step in and give equal funding. So to prove that the state is like able and likely to have bias in the way that it distributes funding to its like all these different political parties is I need to prove that they have the ability to do this, and I need to prove that they have the incentive to do this. So firstly on the incentive, we tell you that, for example, in 2023, when the Labour Party, one of the major parties of the New Zealand political sphere, is headed by a notable, vocal New Zealand Republicanist who thinks that we should secede from the Commonwealth and become our own state, we tell you that the Commonwealth and the Crown, therefore, has an incentive to ensure that National, the main opponent for this, the Labour Party, they have an incentive to prove that the National Party will get into government and defeat Labour and make sure that New Zealand stays part of the Commonwealth. So that is why like the state has an incentive. Another example, like take 1984 election in New Zealand. What happens when like there's an incoming government and you have the Reserve Bank coming, running to their doorstep, begging and saying, please devalue the dollar. They have their own interests. They want to make sure that the government that gets in is going to follow their interests because they themselves have like an incentive in making the country, the state, a better place for everybody. Yeah. So when we tell you that like these states have incentives and huge incentives at that to be a biased entity, a bad actor, the next thing we need to prove to you is that they have the capability to do this. This is the easier burden for me on the split because look, essentially, who is going to stop them? When you have like the highest organization, like the Crown, the state, whatever like organization we're meant to believe is going to be distributing this funding, because again, AF didn't tell us, what happens is that there is essentially no agencies that can act as a handbrake, that can like hold these political parties to account, keep them in check, hold these states in check and make sure that they are, make sure that they are acting fairly. So therefore we have the incentive and the capability for these states to distribute funding unfairly. Look, the next thing I told you is what happens to the absolute stacks of jobs that would be lost under your side. Because look, at best now you can get up and be like, you've left it to your third to like get up and say, oh yeah, by the way, most people working in political parties do it because they want to, so they'll just stay, or like they'll just move to a government job, as you like tried to hint. What we see is that most of the jobs are just funded by the political parties themselves. They're not like paid for by Parliament. This is completely unfeasible to see like a whole industry, because yeah, there are lots of people who study political science, lots of people go into this industry. What happens when all the people that work here just get like shunted out, told, oh, you're either going to have to fight for these small positions in a government job, or you're going to just have to leave. What AF has given themselves as an impossible task to get up in third, fix all the harms in their case, disprove the benefits that we get under the status quo compared to theirs, and also prove how the state is a good actor and that jobs will not be lost. Thank you.
Sorry everyone, this seems to be a slight issue with the live stream, so I'm going to see if I can quickly fix it, but if not, we will just continue. I'll just be one moment. Perfect, it should be okay now. Right, so now welcome up the third speaker of the affirmative team, no worries, to finish their case.
Even if on side F we get one less NRA organisation funding politicians, we win because we get less gun-fueled policy. In today's debate, we've seen three main points of clash. Firstly, what impacts a party's policy more between votes and money? Secondly, what is the effect on extremism? And thirdly, what model impacts poorer people better directly? Now, firstly, I'm going to start with the pathways to victory each team has. So the affirming team have two pathways. We either prove that party policy improves and is better for the most vulnerable people in our society, and this has the biggest weight in today's debate, or secondly, that we reduce extremism. Side neg have two paths as well. They can either show that there is a complete mass growth in extremism and this has the biggest impact on society, or they can prove that there is worse policy and worse impacts on poor people directly. Now let me start with the first point of clash. What impacts a party policy more between votes or money? Now, at minimum, what we need to do to win this is show that money has at least somewhat impactful in decision making. Even if we don't prove what we think we've proved, that it is the main factor, we still show that money has a role in how politicians decide policy. Now, we told you right at first, F, that money, whether parties like it or not, define whether they can get into Parliament. It defines how many ads they can run, how many voters they can reach, and we think this is really important for parties. And we think this works on a sliding scale of donators. We've often had a lot of analysis in this debate about the really mega millionaires, but this occurs in two spheres. Firstly, the mega millionaires, the ones who directly fund for a direct policy, maybe with a specific area, but it also occurs with masses of middle class and rich people who want to say not get their tax increased. Lots of little donations adding up, so there's both implicit and explicit. The response we had to this is, well, people need votes. But what we tell you on side F is this spending on campaigns directly influences how many votes people get. Ultimately, how many voters you can reach is what is going to define who votes for you or not. Voters, on the whole, are really vulnerable to attack ads, vulnerable to lines, because they have no way to fact check this. So we think more money for parties means more influence and gives them the ability to get more votes. But let's assume this isn't the case and take it on their side. Listen, what we think is without money, parties do not have a campaign. Parties need money to be able to, at base, form a campaign.
On that.
No, thank you. Now, we had a big live from Sidneg about shady deals, how we'll get a big growth of illegal deals. We've got three lines to this. Firstly, we tell you people generally don't want to go to prison, and that's probably accepted on both sides of the debate. No one really wants to rot in a hole for multiple years. What we see is no matter what side of the house you take, there is measuring of donations, there is monitoring of bank accounts that occurs. People aren't going to turn a blind eye to the Labour Party's account. So if they get a mysterious $2 million show up in their account, I think someone will be able to connect the dots there. Now, we had, apart from this, let's just ignore, let's pretend people can actually illegally donate. We had a response, people are dodgy, and they need to prove that both politicians and both the donators themselves are dodgy to prove this. We tell you firstly on the sphere of the people donating, we don't think they're to the extent of breaking the law dodgy because we think they like to make money, to live good lives, to live lavish lives with Lamborghinis. They can't be in prison to do this. So yes, we think they may have done some deals in their earlier life that maybe and worsen lives for some people, but we don't think they did explicitly illegal things. And contextually, we see there's so much scrutiny around companies today, we just see this can't happen as much. On the side of politicians, we tell you politicians aren't willing to accept this for two reasons. One, of course, like the greater scrutiny on donations that occurs. Like people are going to want to like cancel a politician who's receiving a bunch of money shadily. But as I tell you, there's really strict monitoring, so it is really unlikely they can get away with it, and a politician knows this. Ultimately, the risk is so huge and so impactful, we don't think anyone in their right mind will ever accept a shady deal. Even if they do, we think it's such minimal amount of cases that it doesn't weigh. So what do we prove? We prove that money has more of an impact on people's policy, and we don't think like the same stream of money from private donors is going to be happening, so we win this point of clash. This point of clash has actually got the highest weight today because policy is the biggest means for impact to a general populace. It is how we like increase benefits for poorer people, how we decrease black mould in state housing, and this is what will impact poor people's lives directly. Now let's move on to the second point. What is the effect on extremism? And ultimately we think this looks like less extremist policy in society. We heard a lot about how we're going to unmarginalise the currently quite marginalised parties, like a big example being the New Conservatives. But we have 6 responses, only one of which we need to prove to win here. Firstly, we don't think it is true that these parties will get like more money, because ultimately these parties often have like one really big donor, one maybe big anti-abortion leader that will give them a lot of money because it's the only party that represents their views. You know, the National Party don't represent anti-abortion views, the ACT Party don't, but New Conservatives do. So they're the only stream to do this. So we think even one mega donor gets them actually quite large amounts. Secondly, we think this point is symmetrical with like good parties delivering, who may be marginalised at the moment, but delivering really good messages that have been forgotten. Thirdly, we don't think people are as stupid as you frame them. Like people ultimately don't buy extremism as much as you're making out, because ultimately, people are educated, and if they have ads about like anti-abortion policy, their morals and how they've been told their whole life is probably gonna outweigh that. Fourthly, we tell you like this point doesn't weigh much because it's a really small amount of parties who are marginalised this far. Fifthly, and there's a whole idea, if you are giving less voice to these marginalised parties, the people who support these parties are going to be more violent. If they don't see their views being represented in the main stage, they are going to be more willing to do a protest that lasts tens of days, not decades, tens of days, such as occupying Parliament's grounds, because they don't see their anti-vax views represented in Parliament. You know, if we at least get the idea that these parties seem represented, we think that's good. I'll happily accept the POI now.
When parties need money to win, as you've stated, doesn't that mean they have direct incentive to accept money illegally?
We think there's probably incentive there, but we think the ability is not there in any world, and we think the risks are so huge. Like, it doesn't matter whether someone wins an election if they're rotting away in solitary confinement. And lastly, on this point about New Conservatives, we ultimately think, like, even if the New Conservatives are getting more marketing, we think this is little policy outcome that's actually going to, like, worsen the lives of women. Like, even if they maybe somehow hit 5%, which we think is really unlikely, they're going to still be a really small voice in Parliament. We don't think, like, abortion laws will be turned around. So we think we get less extremist policy. This point of clash ultimately is lower weight because it is actually not affecting quite a large group of people as, like, policies do, affecting such a large range of people in poverty. And finally, on what impacts poorer people directly, the one point we've had in today's debate about is the loss of money. We accept parties would lose money, and we see this done like impacted in 2 ways. They can like cut attack ads, which we see as a good thing because we have like less scathing attacks and we get better politics as more talking about policy. But sure, even if they like fire the communications specialist, one, we think they're good enough to like find another job elsewhere. But two, even if we accept that, so what? If we're improving poor people's lives, that is ultimately more impactful. That is why we win this point of clash and show we're better for poorer people directly and win today's debate.
Great. I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the third speaker of the negating team to close their side.
We have told you from first in this debate that on their side of the house, they will get worse job opportunities, worse impacts for people on the ground. These are the people that we care about. I will go into these reasons later, but we've told you from first, and this has not been addressed enough. We've told you that parties will become more radical, which has also not been addressed. All of their benefits are relying on parties not being more radical, but we've told you from first why they will be. And then secondly, on more democracy, we have proven throughout this debate that people are still likely to take things like bribes and all of that, and that they will not go to prison, as has been a very strong line on their side, because these are generally untraceable influences such as assets or marketing, and this has not been responded to, and therefore it still stands in this debate. Moving on to my first point of rebuttal, just a little bit on our case and why our case still stands here. Basically, they told us here on our point on extremist parties that platforms don't target the average viewer, therefore they can't grow, all of this. Basically, we tell you that extremist parties have more money for advertising. They agree that advertising is what gives parties the ability to gain voters. Therefore, small extremist parties with more money will gain more voters. Therefore, more people will be radicalized and we will have a more polarized society. The second thing, just defending our case a little bit more here on why people don't buy extremism, this was also very strong on their side. When people are presented with these views constantly and from a very young age, as we would see in society if their policy was introduced, the society begins to believe these values. Society as a whole becomes more radicalized. We see this in the US. It's why there's such a large radical voter base in the US for such extreme policies such as anti-abortion, and why it is not in New Zealand. If we take their case, New Zealand and many other countries like this will become like the US. Society will be more polarized. This is detrimental for everyone because it creates more risk within society as a whole. Moving into my first point of clash here, this is just a bit of a clash on the characteristics of a voter and why they would vote for a certain party. First of all, we both agree that advertising is what draws people to a certain party. Therefore, we win on this immediately because small parties being able to present harmful views more often means more harms to society as a whole. But even if you don't buy this, let's just take the characterization of like a general population, right? Most people don't read every policy, but they are influenced by ads, by campaigns, and these are often targeted. What does this mean? It means that harmful minor parties and major parties, which will become more radicalized, they have enough resources to have undue influence over the population, which can be easily manipulated by these targeted ads, by targeted phone calls, targeted ads on TV and on your computers. This leads to a polarized party system, more radical population. We've been over this throughout our entire case, and this has just not been responded to. Moving on to my second point of rebuttal here, which is about the influence of millionaires on democracy and all of this. This has been very strong on their side, but this simply does not stand in this debate. They have told us that basically, on their side, they'll just fix this by taking away the millionaire's ability to influence. We've told you from first that this is simply not true. But going into a little bit of rebuttal here, just anyway, in case you don't buy all of our case that we've given you from first, parties, especially big parties, which currently have huge ability to fund advertising now, will become so much more desperate for this funding to maintain their voter base. We see this happening through ways such as giving assets or giving ability to market, which we have told you from first, this once again, not responded to. But also we see them, also we see that there is no record of these things, therefore people will be unaware of their influence. The incentive to take these deals does not go away. Therefore, companies will still want this beneficial policy that benefits them, and parties will still want their help because large parties are desperate to maintain their voter base, to stay in power, because this is just the underlying incentive of a party. Secondly here, we have told you over and over again that people will circumvent laws. They're not going to go outright breaking laws. Everyone agrees on this, but this is what their entire case has rested on. Therefore, because people are circumventing these, right, we've told you from first the ways that they do this. Therefore, their points cannot stand. Even if you don't buy this material, though, we have told you how it will harm people on the ground, and this is more important. This is the most important point in this debate. So even if we lose on that there will not be any bribery, it still harms people on the ground. This is the most important part of the debate. Yes, I'll take a POI now.
How can you justify political parties pandering to middle-class people over to poor people in need because their vote comes with an extra $3,000 donation?
Yeah, I'm getting there. That's actually my next point here. The point is about companies not wanting to commit crime, all of this sort of stuff. I've been over this already. So moving on to the next thing here about the pandering pressures. We see that companies can say that they will still provide assets. They will still advertise parties can use their spaces to hold meetings, to advertise. We still see this being an issue on their side of the house, even with the policy. Why is this so terrible though? Because it means that there is no way to regulate this. We see no ability for it to be published online. This is why it is not so harmful in the status quo, but why it will be more and more harmful on their side, because there is no ability to regulate it, no ability to know which companies are doing this and how much they are donating. This is so much worse because people will be aware, people will not know what is happening, and they're more likely to vote for radical parties without knowing the full story behind it. My next point of rebuttal on this is that on their side, they have told us that without pandering to the rich, assuming that we still buy their entire case, which I have proven is not true, that they will take more risks to cater to a person on their side. What does this sound like? This sounds like creating a radical, more polarized society. We've told you from first why this is bad. This means that they agree with us and we win on this. Parties will need to differ themselves from others if everyone has the same level of funding. Therefore, everyone will want to become more radicalized. We see this in the US with a two-party system. We see this becoming more prominent in many other countries. And this is assuming their best case where there's no under-the-table voting. This will still happen because people will still have the resources. Everyone will have equal resources, and it will still be more polarized. And then just a final little bit of clash here about the impacts on the ground. We've told you from first they have not responded to this well enough, but just to recap it anyway, they talked about the wealth gap here, how parties just won't change because they rely on the companies. We've told you how A, they will still rely on companies, B, even if they don't rely on companies, how they will still not be able to do this. But just to recap here, we've told you that 1, there will be a huge job loss in party workforces, and we're not just talking small scale like New Zealand. Imagine we're talking in the US, right? The amount of people, the billions, millions of dollars that go into this, that go into the marketing, the funding, looking at the stats, all of this sort of stuff. So many of these jobs will fall away. There will simply not be enough other jobs to fill this gap, as they tried to tell us that somehow all of these hundreds of thousands of people will just be able to find other jobs. These jobs are just not out there. Secondly, we have told you from first how the budget will be more stretched, therefore it will be worse. This is the most important because even if democracy is better and they win on this, parties still do not even have the ability to impact people and to provide policy that actually helps people because the state's budget will be more stretched, therefore they cannot put as much money into these things that people actually care about. Therefore we win on this. They cannot claim any of their benefits, all of their benefits fail, but our harms still stand, and this is why we win this, even if you do not buy any of our material. Secondly on this, another point of rebuttal here on why parties will not make decisions that benefit the most. Parties, we've told you, are still more likely to make radical decisions to differ themselves from other parties, how they will become more radical. Their incentives are always the same, and you will always be annoying certain groups. But what we see on their side of the house, if they take this, is that there is no way to regulate this. There is no way to make it fair. It will become hugely unfair. Parties will have undue influence and will become more radicalized, and that is why we will win this debate today. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, we'll switch the order and have the negating team come up and present their leaders' reply.
Just like a rich person on either side of the House's worlds, I'm going to give the opposing side something today. I'm going to give you the assumption that, even though we haven't heard how this would work, that, the state is just going to fund political parties, equally at some arbitrary amount that we didn't hear. I'm going to take this material, show you why it's harmful, show you the benefits in comparison that we bring you, and show you why we win. Look, I think that today's debate comes down to 3 points of clash. Firstly, we've got extremism. Secondly, we've got the incentives acting towards rich people and their ability to circumvent law. And finally, the economic cost to the state and therefore the effect on everyday people. Look, so firstly on extremism. In today's debate, we have never needed to prove that everyone who sees a New Conservatives ad becomes a hypnotised zombie that hates Māori people and is off to try and convert the nearest gay person. What we needed to prove is that if the New Conservatives have literally the same budget as the Labour Party, they are likely to reach maybe get a lot of new people through an advertising campaign that they now have the funds to do. What we then needed to prove is that if they are able to do this and get these ads out, they are likely to get even if it's just 1,000 new recruits, they are likely to have immense harm to marginalised communities. They are likely to cause intense trouble and harassment to the everyday people and the everyday voting population. Look, so when we show you all of these things and we show you that, if you fund niche parties that will just, already under the status quo, we have really niche, hate-filled parties, and we show you that they are likely to prosper, likely to get an increased fan base, an increased voter base, they are likely to cause more harm. We win this point here. Additionally, we also tell you that under your side, where you will be guaranteed an income if you start a political party, you'll be guaranteed funding. What you are likely to see among the other people who will just start a political party for the hell of it, you are also likely to see extremists who are now guaranteed a platform, will get guaranteed a vote, and guaranteed a chance to get into government. What we heard from you guys is this kind of burden push about we needed to prove that the New Conservatives are going to be really, really harmful and every person that sees an ad is likely to vote for them. Look, we've never needed to prove this, and we proved the things that we did need to. I think this is an important point to stop and note what an important feature in today's debate. Right from the very start, some of the first words that we heard at first F was that if you are likely to, if you will see an ad for the Labour Party, if you get knocked on by someone, if someone rings your phone from Labour, you are more likely to vote for them, right? Because this set up the entire tone of the debate, which is the more money that political parties get, the more votes that they are likely to get, and therefore all their material about corporatism and stuff is a massive harm on our side. We tell you that this isn't true because right at second, they tell us this also when they say, look, if you see direct voter contact or if you see a TV ad, it's not really likely to change your vote that much, is it? Not only is this internal conflict on their side, it also just wins the point for us, and we've shown you a lot of material on this. But secondly, on the incentives of rich people, what we didn't want for today's debate is to just be this debate about this is what rich people want, this is what rich people want, where we both agree and both try to come up to the same conclusions through different ways. Look, we went on this point when we proved that, look, rich people are already committing crimes, they're likely to circumvent legislation, they're not likely to go to jail, therefore they have an incentive, obviously they have a capability, and look, therefore at the end of the day, on their side, more so than our side, they give donations to political parties. Therefore, we went on this point. And finally, and this was a minor one that they didn't really engage with, is about the economic cost of the state and therefore the effects that they tried to claim for everyday people. We didn't make today's debate how do you do this? How does your side do that? Because of this, we have to draw conclusions. So we'll give the assumption that okay, you get a very small arbitrary amount because you have to fund every political party that is likely to form. We tell you that this is also going to be a huge economic cost to the state and is therefore spreading the state's budget so that they can't deal with the cost of living crisis. We win this point when we outweigh any effects that they give you, and when we win this point, we win all of our points and win the debate. Thank you.
Great, I thank the speaker for their speech, and now I'll come up the AF reply.
How is policy affected by money? Both individual money, lobby groups' money, companies' money. Where does that money go instead of to these parties via donation if we publicize the funding of political parties? Where does that money go? What is the effect on extremism on either side of the house? Do the New Conservatives get more votes or not? And then what are the flow-on effects of us using money from the state to fund these political parties? So, first of all, I saw this debate largely revolve around how policy is affected by money and whether we actually have under the table money going to these parties under our side of the house. So what we see is that, like, what Neg tried to tell you is that the richest money is now unmonitored, and there's going to be lots and lots of fraud, so that, like, they can still get across their incentives to political parties and still see the outcomes that they want. What we told you again and again is that even if we buy this, and even if we say that, like, everyone is going to commit fraud and all these companies are going to be willing to, like, be criminals, we don't think that like, for a company, maybe we buy that BP has criminal incentives, but we've told you that parties actually want to keep their status. We told you that political parties don't want to commit crimes, because both sides agreed that political parties actually want to keep the power and want to get into government so they can get their outcomes that they want. So, in terms of policy being affected by money, we told you again and again that a unique benefit on our side is that Labour now does not have, like, now can implement policy that benefits the poor. That, like, the Democrats or the Republicans are not scared that their biggest donor will leave them, right? We tell you that the unique benefit is that parties with good intentions are now not having to pander to people just because that $2 million rides on them. And we heard this largely unrebutted by the negating side. We think that, like, for bad actors, right, maybe in the worst case scenario, like, a politician is going to accept an illegal bribe from someone, and then obviously that's a negative outcome. But we think it's symmetrical because on our side, that's just legal, and they just accept that donation, and, like, it's the same thing, except it happens more on their side because lots of people don't want to commit crimes. So we think that because policy is so affected by money, and Labour is likely going to listen to donors rather than listen to, like, all of their voters and their poor voters as well, the fact that policy is affected more by money on their side, even if some illegal things happen, we think that that's a big enough harm to win us the debate because we weigh policy so highly, as we told you at Zandi. Like, policy holds a lot of weight because it impacts a lot of people, and that, like, leads me on to how the fact that we use money from the state to fund these parties is actually good because it has this flow-on effect, right? When we use state money, even if we take away a couple government jobs, there's actually a flow-on effect to benefit the most marginalized people because we suddenly are allowed to tax the rich because we're no longer relying on the rich to give us our money for our campaigns. We actually think that regardless of the money that the state spends that they could be immediately using to do something else, it's an investment into the future to stop this, like, incredibly biased system. We think that in terms of extremism, first of all, the New Conservatives have mega rich donors already. This is a problem because as we told you at first, one billionaire can, like, want abortion outlawed and therefore can fund the New Conservatives to have the hundreds of thousands of signs that we saw last election. But they didn't get to 5% because actually largely they're not a very popular party. Even if we buy that ads, like, have a big impact on extremism, we don't think that, like, under Neg's side, it's going to be that much of a harm. And we don't weigh it very highly in the debate either because we think that policy is the most important thing. Thank you.
Right, I'd like to thank everyone for an excellent debate. I invite both sides to cross the floor and shake hands, and we'll get back to the adjudication Monday.
Good job.
Do we?
I guess